In this assignment, we're going to finally graph these functions. We haven't worried about the phase shift yet. That kind of throws everything in for a loop. But worrying about the period, that's going to be the big focus. Midline, amplitude, kind of putting those together is also going to help out. So what I have here is I have the basic sine and the basic cosine graph. So that's what you see here. Ignore this axis. I'm saying 10. Just picture that that's a 1. There we go. So now it works for us, right? I'm actually just going to erase that, but just pretend that's what you see. So sine starts in 0. Think of the unit circle. When you're at the beginning of the unit circle, right, the y value is 0. Then the y value becomes 1. That's what you see here. Then the y value becomes 0 again. That's what you see here. Then the y value becomes -1. That's what you see there. And then last it ends at 0 again. So that's what sine does. So what I want you to see here is that we can break this. So the whole period, in this case, in the usual case, it's 2 pi, because that's how long it takes for us to get through the unit circle. But we did see in the last section that period can change. So depending upon the length of our period, we can still break apart this graph into fourths. And that's really what I want you to focus on with this one. So I'm breaking this down into fourths. So for you, what you can see here is in the first fourth, sine starts at 0 and then goes up, depending upon the amplitude. In just a basic sine graph, the amplitude's 1. But if this was 3, we would go all the way up to 3. And then in the next fourth, we come back down to 0. Then we go back down to -1 and come right back up to 0 again. So we break this into quarters, break the period into quarters, and see what each part does. Starting at 0, goes up, then comes back down, goes down to 0, and goes up again. And once again, that's just sine going through the unit circle. It starts at 1, then it becomes 0. Or no, it starts at 0, then it becomes 1, then 0 again, and then -1. That's what sine does. That's the y values. Cosine a little bit different, right? Before I go over cosine, I do want to point out if sine is, there's a negative in front of sine, just flips this upside down. It goes to -1, then +1. That's if it's negative sine of theta, just to point that out. Cosine, if you remember the unit circle, cosine starts at 1, then goes to 0. That's why I was getting mixed up a little bit there. Then -1, because it's the x values, then 0, and then back to 1. And that's what you see here. Breaking into quarters, we start at 1, then after a quarter of it, we end up at 0. Then for the next quarter, we end up down in -1. Then the next quarter, we end up back at 0, and then back up to 1 to finish off. So there's your 4 quarters there. And realize if it was negative cosine, instead it'll just start at -1 and then go to 0. But notice it starts on the max or the min and then goes to the midline, compared to sine starts on the midline and then goes up to the max or the min. Depending upon, if it's a negative, then you know the next thing's the minimum. So starts on midline, then it goes to maximum. Maybe I'll set some instructions here. And it's just going right through the unit circle. That's all we're doing. So sine of theta, first midline, always starts on midline. Second, max. Third, back to midline. Fourth, the min. Max if negative. Then back to the midline. And that's just going right through the unit circle. That's what's going on. For cosine, first is the max. min if negative. Second is the midline. Third is the min, but max if negative. Fourth is back to the midline. And then fifth will be back to the max or min if negative. And it's just based on the key values of the unit circle here. I should probably just kind of give you a better unit circle to go by. And that's what we're going by, is those four main values, right? So sine starts at 0, which would be the midline. Then it goes to 1, which would be the max. Then it goes back down to 0, and then so on. So just following the unit circle, that's all we're doing. So let's go ahead and finally graph this. So let's start with the midline. Midline is going to be -7. So I'm going to go down to -7. There it is. And let me just put a line there at -7 to represent our midline. There it is. And then I know my amplitude is 2. So let me put the amplitude. I'm going to put the line for the amplitude. Is going to be, that means the maximum that's going to go up to is up 2 from that spot. And also down 2 from that spot, which I kind of cut off in this graph. Okay, so we're going to start. There's no phase shift. That's what's fortunate about this one. But we're going to start then on the midline, because sine starts on the midline, starts at 0, starts at the starting point. Let's figure out our period. So our period is going to be 2 pi over b. All I did was change that 2 pi into a fraction there. And then that's going to equal 20. So remember, what you see here is this is broken into the quarter system here. So one point given is the midline, the other point given is the max or the min. So they're giving us 2 points. This point is the midline point. And this point here is the max or min. So we need to make sure they're really we're focused on the first 2 points here, point 1 and point 2. So for sine, we're starting on the midline, then we're going to have the max. On cosine, we got to switch that around. We start on the max, and then we do the midline point. So we're really just focused on that first quarter, and then con will do the rest for us. Same thing here, focused on that first quarter, and then con will do the rest for us. So starting with this, we got to figure out our period is 20. So I'm going to do a quarter of the period. So our quarter is going to happen at 5. So right here will be our second point. And that's going to adjust it, so that's going to be like this part, and then you can just picture our graph. You know, down, it'll come back down, and it'll automatically do that for you on con when you graph it. And then it'll just continue on like that. So really, you're just focused on that first quarter, that first point and that second point. So a quarter, the whole period's 20, so a quarter of it will be 5, so a quarter of it later. So we have our first point, then our second point. There would be our third, fourth, and then fifth. One thing with con, we only have the 2. Let's see. Oh, and there's the solution right there. I went ahead and plotted the solution. Of course, It's a different view of the graph because you can see I cut off the top and show the bottom. Let's look at cosine and then one more sine after that. So let's start with our amplitude. And then our period. Our equation, the midline. I'm going to go ahead and just put that equation in the midline here. So 3, there's our midline. And then our amplitude's 4, so we're going to be going up 4 from that spot. So up to 7, that's how high up we're going to go, because the amplitude's the distance from the midline. And then also down 4 from that area is going to be at -1. Hopefully you guys can count. I've had some students struggling with counting in the past when it comes to this. So we know we're going to be, this is the midline, the middle of it, and then the maximum is going to be up at this point, and then the midline, and then the minimum down here, because the amplitude is how far those things are from that spot. Let's go ahead and look at our period now. So our period is going to be 2 pi over 1. There's no number in front of that. It's just going to be 2 pi. So if we want to cut this into quarters, 2 pi over 4, it's going to be pi over 2. So half of a pi. Which, notice, that works fine because they gave us that here. Okay, now notice because it's negative, that means we're actually, instead of, because cosine, remember, starts at the maximum and then comes down to the midline, if you look at the first quarter of it. But negative means we're going to start upside down. We're going to start the minimum and then come up to the midline. So we're going to actually start here. And then we're going to come to the midline a quarter of the way. So at pi over 2, so half of a pi would be right here. See, this is half of a pi. It's right there. So that's where our quarter is going to happen. And that's going to be our first quarter of it there. From there, I would just make mention, here's your maximum / minimum point. So you want to make sure that's what's placed here. And then this is your midline point. So make sure this is placed at the midline. And Con will self-adjust for it. Right here it does. You can see it does the rest of the graph. Once you get that first quarter, you're good. Okay, one more example. We'll go through this pretty quick here. So amplitude, it's going to be 5. And you'll notice this is an upside down sine graph because it's negative. So instead of going up, instead of going to the hill first, we'll go to the valley first. And then y equals, our midline is going to be -3. So let me start by graphing that. And then remember, so we're going to be up 5 from there. So our maximum for the graph will be here. And we'll also be down 5 from there, which will be at -8 right there. Then our period, 2 pi over 1 over 7. 2 pi over 1, right? So you just flip and multiply. Times 7 over 1 is 14 pi. So if we want to break that into quarters, that's 7 pi over 2, or 2 goes into 7 3 times with 1 left over. 3.5 pi. So that quarter is going to happen right here. So sine starts on the midline. Then the next point's the max or min. Since it's negative, we're actually going to go to the minimum, and we're going to want to go to that quarter spot right there. And you can see this was correct in Con right here. It does that exact same thing. Make sure, once again, this is your midline point. Make sure that goes there. There's your max min point that goes there. So it's really just the cosine that these are going to get flipped around. So just be careful that midline ends up on the midline point and so on.